And I think that looking briefly at a few periods of art history might help us also understand the evolution of the art quilt as a genre, and I think perhaps give us a sense of place and also context in terms of what we need to do to further the movement, or perhaps move it away from the very sort of closed community that it has been, which is expanding as we speak, and which I know many of us would like to take mainstream. Romanticism was a period from 1800 to 1850, and I think this is where the beginning of our conversation about art is relevant, because up to that point we were dealing mainly with classicism, and we don't see that so much in the quilt world, but we do see references that actually go back as far as this. And what I found, this is a painting by J.M.W. Turner, you may be familiar with him. It's a period that began a break with classical traditions. And I have realized, as I looked at this and thought about it myself, what a truly evolutionary process it is in a sense. In 1867, you may be familiar with this painting, which translates, and I would never try even to begin to pronounce it in French. This is The Luncheon on the Grass by Edouard Manet. And this was totally shocking, and it wasn't necessarily because of the nude woman and the clothed men, although in this day and age, perhaps that still has some shocking sensibility, as much as it also had to do with the fact that he organized the surface in a way that was quite unusual for the period, and that the perspective wasn't really quite right, and that there was this weird still life in the bottom corner, and that the man on the right is wearing a hat that normally would not have been worn out of the bedroom. So it caused a scandal in the French art world, but it was a precursor to the ushering in of modern art as we know it. And we're all familiar with Impressionism. Of course, we have Monet and these beautiful paintings, and his handling of light. And Mary Cassatt, who was one of the females involved in that period. Even Manet painted in this style for a while. Back up there. And I was lucky enough to be in the Museum d'Orsay in Paris, the Orsay Museum in Paris last summer. And I just had to laugh, and I thought, isn't it nice to be old enough to look at a wall in a major museum in the world and see the same scene painted by 10 different, which is kind of brilliant of them really, 10 different impressionists, or artists painting in the impressionistic style, and some of them were really bad. So Matisse had this really bad knockoff. You could tell he could hardly wait to be done and get out of there. Of course, he moved into another era after that. And so what does that have to do with where we are as artists, quilt makers, except that it is one more indication of how, no matter what the style was, no matter what the period was, artists were trying on particular ways of working for a while and then discarding them if they didn't really fit. And so we as quilt makers, we as artists, no matter what our genre, and I'm not really a quilt maker anymore, but it's true for me too, what are we really doing but trying on styles and wanting to come up with something that feels like an authentic fit? So this is I'm not going to try and pronounce Van Gogh in the way that it should really be pronounced either. I'm going to call him Van Gogh for our purposes here. But here was another example of someone who had one foot in that impressionistic world for a while, as did his friend Paul Gauguin. But they were really more in love with color than they were with the pointillistic style of painting. And so eventually there was a bit of a break there, and they went off to their various places and painted in the way that meant the most to them, and really were examples of artists who didn't really fit in anywhere and just kept trying to do something that was unique. Then we turn into an era that starts as kind of what we would refer to as expressionistic. But in the meantime, we've got, and it was amazing to me to really look at this and see all the various styles and the various movements, and how artists have all their, through every era, tried to carve out their own personal little niche to identify themselves in some way that is recognizable and unique and distinct. And so we have between 1890 and 1910 the Art Nouveau, or in Germany the Jugendstil. And the desire was to unite applied and fine art, and this was just another scandal. People looked at these paintings and they didn't think Gustav Klimt should introduce all those decorative elements, and that wasn't what art was about. And it was, again, shocking, and yet the artists who were part of that movement felt to their core that this was something that was worth exploring and proceeding with. And during this particular period, finally some of these guys got their sea legs. So Matisse figured out what he was really good at and what he really loved, and he quit trying to buy into the popular opinion. He just did what he loved. As did Edvard Munch. Meanwhile, the German expressionists were establishing their own sort of little niche in the world. And I'm a particular fan of Franz Marc. I love his use of color. So there was a certain fluidity between the movements as these artists were exploring various concepts and sharing ideas. And you may be familiar with the work of Kandinsky and the fact that he really, really, really wanted his work to be about the spirit. He wanted the color to be symbolic. He wanted this to be about something that was bigger than art and touched God. And of course, in 1900, Picasso was born. And this is one of the visionaries of really all of recorded art history. He single-handedly developed one style after another, including Cubism. And his friend Fernand Léger was working in a similar style and trying to do something that was completely new in terms of taking forms, human forms, for example, and reducing them to some geometric, understandable, quantifiable form. Now, during this period, there are any number of smaller groups who are forming and trying to find their way, and they included, I have to read them because I don't have them memorized, Futurism, Orphism, Rayonism, Dada, and the Bauhaus Design School, which we're familiar with. And every single one of them was labeled as degenerate by the Nazis. So there's this interesting thread of control issues that weaves through the history. This is one of my favorites. This is Picabia, and he had one foot in Cubism, but he was moving forward into his own expression, and he became friends with other artists who were really exploring ideas that were eventually identified as Surrealism. Including René Magritte and Salvador Dali. And we could skip ahead. This could be a lecture on art, but it really isn't. It's a lecture on quilts. So we could skip ahead to the abstract expressionists, just in order to cut things, closer to the contemporary period, my lifetime. And these are particular favorites of mine, and they include Clifford Still, and Mark Rothko, and Helen Frankenthaler. And of course, all of that folded into pop art, and Andy Warhol, and the whole idea that popular culture could be turned into something that was flat and repeatable, and that this was definitely a comment on what the culture of the time was in a broader sense. And it would take another hour to graze the surface of postmodernism, and I'm not even going to start. But I do want to talk about Robert Rauschenberg just briefly, because I think what he called combines, which were these collaged pieces that incorporated all kinds of elements onto the painted surface. Ironically enough, one of the most famous combines, which is in Robert Shaw's book on quilts and was actually referenced almost everywhere I went to do any research like this, was his piece that has an antique quilt glued to the surface. And I would hazard a guess, although I don't know, that that piece probably sold for more than all of the art quilts that sold last year combined. And is that what a combine is? I don't know.